and open the Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Cool Davis Coalition quarterly meeting. Today we're featuring Kerry Loux from the City of Davis to speak with us about the current work of the Climate Action and Adaptation Plan that is started in April, and it will be going on through over the summer. And into next fall. And we have several panelists with us today. Please just, enter, and if you would put your name and maybe what neighborhood or organization you're from into the chat, that would be great. And when we get, close to the number of people that we think are planning on attending today, we'll get started with our meeting. We ask you to leave your video and your audio off until the sort of back end of the meeting, when we will have a kind of an open Q&A time. I think I did see Lynn come in the door. Is that right? Oh, there you are, Lynn.
Yes, I abandoned my other meeting midstream.
It's a busy day.
Yeah.
Lots of things going on out there. So go ahead and put your name and where you are from in Davis or in the area, and anything other, if you represent a particular organization. Glad to have you join us today. All right, I think we'll get started. Lynn, if you would do the land acknowledgement, that would be terrific.
Yes, let's see. Can you hear me? We should take a moment to acknowledge the land on which we are gathered. For thousands of years, this land has been the home of the Patwin people. Today, there are 3 federally recognized tribes, Patwin tribes. Kachil Dihi Band of Wintun Indians of the Calusa Indian community, Kletzel Dihi Wintun Nation, and Yocha Dihi Wintun Nation. The Patwin people have remained committed to the stewardship of this land over many centuries. It has been cherished and protected as elders have instructed the young through generations. We are honored and grateful to be here today on their traditional lands.
Thank you, Lynn. Today, we're glad that you could join us for the Cool Davis Coalition meeting. We have a number of people here with us today, and I'd like to thank them all for joining us. I'd like to start first today with first introducing our lead speaker from the City of Davis, and our panelists. And I'd also like anyone who is attending who's a member or leader of one of our working groups to just unmute and introduce yourself and say something about what's happening right now with your working group with Cool Davis. So we're going to keep this brief, and we'll start the formal presentation at about 4:45. So we're really glad to have with us today Kerry Loux, who is the Sustainability Coordinator for the City of Davis, and she is the staff responsible for our current climate action planning process and the work that she's doing with both city staff members, a technical advisor committee, and the city consultant that is working with us on the development of the climate action plan. We also have with us today Larry Gunther, who is representing both Tree Davis, and he's also on the Tree Commission. And he's been asked to kind of speak to our green infrastructure as a member of the panel today. Also with us is Bill Dakin, who is one of the principal engineers with Frontier Energy, also formerly known as Davis Energy Group, which has been involved in a lot of the City of Davis's energy planning for many years. And he's going to be reflecting on building energy. Also with us today is Lisa Baker, who is formerly the director of Yolo Community Housing, Yolo County Housing, sorry, and is been a longtime advocate for affordable housing. And she'll be talking with us today about equity in housing and the relationship to our CAAP planning. And finally, in our group of panelists today, we have Jim Kramer, who will be kind of reflecting from a neighborhood, a personal perspective, and also in his work with his faith community around reducing greenhouse gases at that level in the community. So are any of our working group members here today?
I can do Yolo Interfaith Alliance.
All right, go ahead, Lynn.
So the Yolo Interfaith Alliance for Climate Justice has had a relatively quiet year given COVID, but we did continue to meet monthly, and we helped to organize the Climate Speaker Series that some of you may have attended one or more sessions of. It began with Kim Stanley Robinson in February and 3 speakers after that. The last was last week. So that was our major, I think, visible undertaking. And we also had a wonderful presentation by a member of the St. Martin's Church, the Episcopal Church, talking about how you can have a more sustainable church, all the work they had done over a period of years to make their campus more and more sustainable. And lots of church members from various congregations tuned into that, as many of them are working on their own faith community. And that translates because as individuals undergo that effort at their gathering place, then they also take it home and do that same work in their homes. So it's a good process. And we're just now taking a survey of ourselves and thinking, all right, what do we want to do next? What do we want to do in our community to begin to think more about carbon reductions and actions that we can help our community to move itself right along as things become increasingly urgent. We are also working with St. Martin's Episcopal as they've got some property and some projects in mind that they felt were larger than they as one congregation could do, that they would need a broader support. So we don't know yet how that will shape up, but it's going to be exciting work, we think. So that's where we are.
Who'd like to go next? I think I saw Richard Bode.
Sure, give me a second here. I'll turn that video on. There we go. So I'm Richard Bowden. I'm representing the Davis Electric Vehicle Association. And after a year of being on Zoom meetings, we're actually hoping to break out soon. And it's actually a pretty exciting time for electric vehicles and how to reduce those transportation emissions. So there's a lot of incentives going on in Washington, and we hope will translate to more EV sales. And then there's a good deal of effort with infrastructure. So that charging infrastructure, that is. So it's available for not only people who are homeowners, but also those in apartment buildings. So a lot going on, especially with the new administration.
Thanks, Richard. And I do believe I saw both Alan Hirsch and I think Scott Stewart is here, who might want to talk about a little bit about what's going on with the Yolo Emergency Climate Coalition. So either one of you want to start?
Hi, Alan.
Hi, Alan.
Hi. Yolo Mobility is a small group, but we're enthusiastic. We've been following about 4 or 5 different transportation commissions and the Yolo Bus meeting, the Yolo Bus Citizens Advisory Committee meeting, Unitrans, and BSSCT or whatever it is called, and trying to put it all together and to push alternate modes other than bicycle and walking and cars. And we think deep in the radar. So we're working on that just by being present and monitoring, putting things together. And and we're looking for more people to join in our group. And the city is on board with the 5th Street, the Russell Boulevard reimaginement, but there's stuff to be done in the other parts of the county. And social equity is front and center in what we're trying to do in terms of making sure there are alternate modes for all people. We need some transit reparations and micro transit reparations. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alan. Scott?
Hi there. Welcome. Thank you for having me. And I wanted to just reflect on what the Yolo Climate Emergency Coalition has been doing. We are actually becoming a working group within Cool Davis. So thanks to Chris for that. Yes, the county has now established a committee called the Yolo Climate Yolo County Climate Action Commission. This commission is going to have a budget, and it's going to have 11 members, 5 of whom will be picked by our supervisors, 2 of whom will be picked for technical reasons also at large by the supervisors, and 2 more by the 5 members that are selected by the supervisors. So that's 9, and then there's 2 more. The idea being is those positions are being selected now. Applications are open. It's a standard application through the county. And if you were interested in finding that application or finding people who are interested in applying, let me know through chat. Also, the Yolo Climate Emergency Coalition is putting together a project called Comida Digna. It's a very, I will call it a cultural shift toward food sovereignty and allowing for more resilience in Yolo County, particularly for marginalized communities. So there you are.
Thank you, Scott. So we just encourage any of you that are interested in any of these working groups and the work they're doing, and it sounds like fun to you. Well, they're always glad to have more people involved in their work. So you can look on our website for connections to the Cool Davis working groups. And any of you who want to share contact information in the chat also is a great way to connect. So please go ahead and do that, working group leaders, if you want to. So I think we'll get started now with our presentation today. Kerry, I'll go ahead and share screen for your slides, and we can get started. to try again here.
While you're getting those up, I'll say thank you to Cool Davis for this opportunity. I really appreciate it. And to everybody who is on the call, I see a lot of familiar faces, and I appreciate everyone that was able to participate in the first workshop on April 22nd. I see a lot of you here, and many of you helped us with some of the facilitation and moderating, and there are lots of community experts in this group, so this will be hopefully a great conversation. And my goal tonight is to give you an overview of our CAAP process and where we are now and where we're going, and to do that in a fairly brief presentation so that there's plenty of time for either questions of me and or for panel discussion. So this first slide, this is actually an update to the 2010 Climate Action and Adaptation Plan, which was created following 2 years of community engagement and input, but it was also a plan that was an early adopter plan for the city of Davis. So there were not many standards or guidelines available for how to do a climate action plan at that time. And the goals at that time were somewhat striking. To be claiming to be carbon neutral by 2050 was a fairly early statement of what communities could do. It was way ahead of the state guidelines. And now we have updated that target to be a 2040 target for carbon neutrality, which is 5 years ahead of the current state goal of 2045. So while this is a robust update that could almost be called a new climate action and adaptation plan, we are building on what was done in 2010 and taking a look at what was identified as actions then. We're seeing what has been accomplished, what still needs to be done, what is no longer really viable. And we're also trying to create a plan that is much more measurable than the previous one was, so that we have a true roadmap to carbon neutrality by 2040 with a 2030 interim target. So that also meets state goals, as well as the information that was included in the City of Davis Climate Emergency Resolution, which stated that we were going to take expedited action to do as much carbon reduction as we can by 2030 with the overall goal of 2040. So that's where we are. This word map that you can see on this slide was actually created following one of our first internal meetings with people's statements about what does success in climate action planning mean to you. And those statements were compiled and put into a word map app, and this is what we came up with. And I'm fairly pleased to say that when we had an equity expert, Jonathan London, come speak to the Natural Resources Commission, he said that he loves this graphic because it includes the things he wants to see: equity, inclusive, diverse, action, justice, etc. And this was from some of our community experts in subject areas. So we can go to the next slide. So some of what I'm going to tell you about, I think many of you are already familiar with, but again, this is an overview. We have established a CAAP project with basically 3, if you want to call them, legs of input. So one of the key components of our CAAP project is the community outreach that we are doing, which we do have a consultant, but the City of Davis staff is taking the lead on much of the community outreach, which is a series of workshops. We've had one already, as I already mentioned, and we have some upcoming ones that are going to be more topic specific. We're doing some online surveys. Once we are able to, we hope to do some pop-ups at community events such as farmers market or other events that may start to happen more frequently. And we'll also hopefully be doing, as we evolve the process, we'll be doing some focus groups and or meetings at specific locations. Like I know I talked to Elizabeth about doing a meeting at Rancho Yolo, and there would be many other places that we want to go to get specific input. So that's our process. It is evolving. We are adding things as we get more input. And in addition to the actual outreach, we have the CAAP webpage on the city website, which is really quite full of detailed information. And I put that link in the chat. If you have not had a chance to take a look at it, I encourage you to do so. Most of our information is linked there, and there's a lot of information going back to the, prior to the 2010 CAAP. So if you do notice something that is missing, please let us know. And if you have comments on any of that, you can use the email contact, which goes specifically to the project management team. And we also just set up an email list or listserv so that everybody that signs up to that for that will get information. We have been going to some commissions as well as to community partners like Cool Davis. There's a monthly report at Cool Davis board meetings on what we're doing, and we've gone to some other groups as well. So we're trying to be as transparent and inclusive as possible. And Leslie just put on links both directly to the survey, which you can get either from the website or through the link that Leslie put up. It's available in both English and Spanish. The best way to get all of this information is to go to the City of Davis website, go to the spotlight and click on the CAAP, and you'll go straight to the webpage, and all of those links are right there. So continuing with this, the second leg is our city team, which includes the project management team, which I'm proud to say is an interdisciplinary team. We have Diana Jensen, the city engineer in the Public Works Transportation and Engineering Department, is the project director, and I am the project manager. I'm in the Community Development and Sustainability Department. We also have a monthly meeting with an interdepartmental staff team to give updates and get input from members of every department at the city. So we're trying to start from the very beginning with having a very participatory project. The city team also includes the consultant AECOM, as well as, of course, City Council and our commissions. The Natural Resources Commission is the lead advisory body, and staff liaisons to every other commission get monthly staff reports to send to their commissions so that all commissions are kept up to date. And we have a number of commissions that have representatives that come to Natural Resources Commission meetings to discuss issues that are of concern to them. And finally, we have a technical advisory committee to support the city team and the overall project, which includes local and university experts in significant areas of expertise. So next slide. This is our organizational chart, which kind of takes those three legs of input and puts it into how this project is being managed. So City Council is at the top of the chart, obviously, and we have both Mike Webb and Ashley Feeney, our city manager and assistant city manager, are aware of all that is going on. And then Diana and I as project director and manager. And then we both work directly with the city team. One thing I didn't mention is that we do regular reports also to department heads and other staff. The Technical Advisory Committee, and you can see the topic areas on there that we have represented on the TAC, and the community input. So we've gone over that. So I guess next slide would be good. I hope I'm not speaking too fast or glossing over everything, but there'll be a chance for questions. So, and if something's not clear, you can even raise your hand now and I can try to answer it. This is our slide that identifies some of the project goals that were included in the request for proposals when we selected our consultant. But as you know, City Council over the last few years and even before that have established actions for climate action and carbon reduction, the most recent of which being the climate emergency resolution, which in addition to setting a more aggressive target of 2040 for carbon neutrality, also identified some other goals and targets that we are working on in the CAAP, such as including equity and diversity and being an advocate statewide for CAAP measures. So you can see the climate emergency resolution and everything that's included in that, once again, on the CAAP website. So that's linked on there. Other goals are to incorporate and prioritize equity and inclusion, to establish the GHG reduction target for both 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2040. And as I mentioned before, these will help with future project streamlining within the city, as well as align with the state goals. We're doing a vulnerability assessment to evaluate and identify strategies to reduce climate risk. And also very importantly is there is current state legislation relating to climate action that does not necessarily require a climate action plan, but it does require actions toward addressing climate impacts. And we need to get the City of Davis up to date on that current state legislation. So next slide. This is a graphic that was prepared by the consultant, but I think it is a good one to identify what we're trying to do with this process. So we're in the process of completing steps 1 and 2, which is analyzing the greenhouse gas emissions that we already have and looking at both the 2010 CAAP and our current efforts, and to establish some greenhouse gas targets as a preliminary measure that the community can then address. We have completed the first workshop, as we've noted, and are in the midst of the first online survey. And I just found out today that we have 120 responses so far to the survey, which is a good start, but we're hoping to get quite a few more. We are just beginning to develop and prioritize actions for the GHG greenhouse gas reduction. And again, this is going to be an iterative process where the community has input on these things. But if you look at the world of potential climate actions, there are hundreds of possible actions out there, and we want to select the ones that are most appropriate for Davis to get us to our target and identify how to establish them, measure them, and create that roadmap to carbon neutrality by 2040. Some of the next steps are to write and implement the plan, do the environmental review process and public input. And then once the plan is done, we need to implement it, monitor it, continue to modify it as necessary, and keep community input and participation a part of the process. So next slide. And this is hard to see, but this is a draft schedule that needs some revision, but essentially it shows where we are now. We signed the contract with our consultant at the end of 2020 and took a few months to get the project framework set up and to do some meetings with our internal staff team in preparation for releasing the online survey in March and doing the first workshop in April. And so now we're in May and we're getting ready for the second introductory workshop focusing on equity. And then we have a schedule of meetings with council, additional workshops with that, where we'll get into the meat of the substance of our actions. And then once we gather all of that information, we will write the report, do the CEQA or environmental review process. And we're hoping to fast track some of the stuff happening in 2022. So we have an earlier date for that. So I know a lot of community members are anxious to see all of the substance of the plan, but in order to get all of this input and work with the community, we need some lead time. And we haven't started talking about exactly what the transportation goals are going to be or what the building energy goals are going to be. We're going to be having community input on that. And we've established some of those by looking at what co-benefits the community desires and talking about what some of the targets might be. So next slide. So some of those first steps that we identified are the vulnerability analysis. So I think that these ideas are pretty familiar to everyone, that climate threats include poor air quality, both drought and flooding related to precipitation, heat waves and more intense heat and longer heat, and all of the impacts that those issues bring to our community. Poor air quality, of course, is related to wildfires, and we have also felt that in quite an extreme way in the last few years. So next slide. And the consultant has a draft vulnerability assessment completed. We're still working on finalizing that, and that has, some of the components of that have been presented at our first workshop and with some of our other regularly meeting groups. And this one slide just shows some of the human impacts that our climate risks have on our population in Davis. So the specifics of this aren't necessarily something that I wanted to talk about now, other than that we're completing that plan and we'll get it approved by council and posted on the website once it's complete. Next slide. And then on the greenhouse gas emissions reduction, that's another thing that we're working on now. So where do our emissions come from? As we all know, transportation is the biggest issue for most communities, and Davis in particular. If you add up all of the transportation emissions, we're over 70%. Buildings and energy, especially existing infrastructure and existing buildings, are close to 20%. And then we have other components like solid waste, wastewater, food and consumption, and other issues that are a little less than 10%, but also are things that we can address in our community. Next slide. And this is the graphic of what was the result of the it was actually an inventory completed in 2019 with 2016 baseline data. And so you can see this pie chart that shows the different components of the inventory. And I'll just digress for a moment to mention why our inventory is 2016. It's because we did a regionally integrated inventory, which we were very, very pleased to do. So Yolo County and the other cities in Yolo County came together to do this GHG inventory as a unit. And Yolo County had already completed a 2016 inventory, so we wanted the same baseline for all of our communities. Additionally, that was the data that was available in 2018 and 19 because we didn't have some of this data available at that time from, for example, PG&E and other sources. So while the state is at, I believe, 2017 or 2018 data, our data is 2016. There are some components that aren't included in that. But right now we're focusing on the climate action and adaptation planning. And at some point in the near future, we'll do an update to our GHG inventory. Next slide. So the next step that we'll be talking with the community about is all about this thing I mentioned earlier, which is prioritizing the greenhouse gas emissions reduction actions for the Davis CAAP. And we're going to be considering 3 elements as we prioritize which actions make the most sense for us to identify. Of course, we need to know what kind of greenhouse gas reduction potential there is by any particular action, because we want to highlight ones that give us some benefit. And then the co-benefits analysis basically says, what are other goals that the city of Davis has identified that will also be impacted by our target actions in the climate action plan? So what is most important to us? What has already been identified by city council and the community? Things like air quality, improved transportation, improved and habitat and wildlife. There's a whole list of co-benefits that are also impacted by the selection of actions that we identify. And our consultant has helped develop and has worked with a tool called the Action Selection and Prioritization tool. And we've had a presentation of that. Basically, it's a tool that provides a lot of input that is customized for Davis desires and goals, and comes out with the highest value actions that we can do to be considered for inclusion in our CAAP. So next slide. And this is just one of the slides of the presentation of this tool. And it's hard to read, but you can see at the top, each action that was identified in a particular area was given values. The different colors are the co-benefits. The main line is 0, and some of the actions had negative impacts on a particular co-benefit, and other actions had beneficial, and you can see some of the highest value ones. And that's also put into a graph. So you can see the upper right quadrant is the types of actions that you would want to prioritize most highly. And the specifics are not so important. This was done for another community, but as I said, this tool is customizable to Davis intentions, local control, cost, etc. So next slide. And this is also on the website. This is the community outreach that we have planned. So we've completed we're in the midst of doing the first survey online. As I mentioned before, we've completed the first workshop, which was introductory and had a goal of providing information to the community and getting input from the community. And the second workshop that's happening next week on Thursday at 5 p.m. is one that the project management team added to our schedule in response to community stakeholders who really wanted to see more focus than was already being paid on the equity and inclusion. And so we have a workshop coming up on May 27th at 5 p.m. Okay. So, and then you can see on this slide, upcoming workshops will happen in July. It says July and July because we're going to have we're going to do 2 different workshops that dive into the technical aspects of actions that we might want to take and get community input. We may be slightly revising those timeframes, but each of those workshops 2 and 3 will be repeated the way we're envisioning them now. And then workshop number 4 is sort of the summary of what actions we have identified. So even though it says workshops 1 through 4, that actually includes 7 or 8 different workshops for the community to participate in. And then also on there are some target dates for reports into City Council, which is another opportunity for community input. Okay, next slide. And this slide was just to give a bit of a background for what we did on Earth Day, April 22nd. And all I'll really say about that, since many of you were there, and again, I really appreciate that, we had over 100 participants. There were 94 concurrent participants at any one time, but there were 105 different people that we identified that were there for all or part of the meeting. And we had 9 breakout rooms to discuss issues. And we're compiling those overall themes and issues now, and we'll be addressing those with upcoming community input. So final slide. And this gives you some of the things that we're hoping that you will do. Tonight, you're here. Next week's workshop is really more of a panel discussion that will be happening, and then signing on to the email list and doing the online survey. So hopefully I didn't skim over too much or take too long, because I really do want to have time for interaction. I saw some questions and information pop up in the chat, but I wasn't really able to follow that while I was talking. So I'm done. Thank you, Chris, for advancing the slides for me.
Sure. Thank you, Kerry. I did want to give a quick time for any clarifying questions. That is, if there was something in Kerry's presentation you didn't understand and you wanted to clarify that, rather than comments, or we'll have some time later to talk about, after the panel, strategies and key impacts or issues that you want to have raised in the climate action plan. But any clarifying questions, please raise your hand.
So I know, Leilani, one of your questions was, what is off-road in Davis? Is that the one you're going to ask again?
That was the one I was going to ask again, and I have a second one if there's time.
Okay, great. Well, I think off-road would be really things like truck transportation within a manufacturing site or something like that, or you know, some of the work at the that's done at the at Recology. There's a lot of movement around there. So there are a lot of there are a lot of greenhouse gases that are emitted that are not necessarily on our public roads. And I can look into that and give you a more complete answer, but that's a bit of an overview of what those would entail.
No need to follow up. Thank you. That's helpful. I was just trying to imagine what those things are based on my experience moving around in Davis. The other question I had, a clarifying question, was about whether and how much and where emergency preparedness, for the sake of actual, like, protecting life and limb, in the face of, you know, danger, where does that fall within the goals, and where I saw a couple of things that seemed like they obliquely referred, like there's a mention of resiliency. Obviously health and wellness was one of the values that might be included in that ASAP tool, that nifty tool that you just shared, but I didn't really naturally see where actual, you know, actual emergency management would fall in your process, and whether it's even relevant for the process that the CAAP is going through.
Well, I think it's definitely relevant. It is not the primary focus of the CAAP. You know, the Yolo County does the hazard mitigation plan, and there are other sources for that. But we do have on our internal team that meets on a monthly basis, we have representatives of both police and fire, as well as our information systems component and our city manager's office that will identify anything if we're like veering into creating problems. But what I think you're asking about more is how do we prevent issues with our CAAP actions? And so we feel that that's a city team issue. And we want to make sure that we have those voices heard as we're developing our CAAP. And we want it up front, not at the end. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, well, I think what I was mostly, when I think about climate action and adaptation, I think how well can the city or the region be able to respond to climate emergency related immediate disasters and immediate threats to life,
right?
And it just seems like such an important feature of the process of thinking as a community about the climate crisis.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the two main goals of a climate action and adaptation plan are greenhouse gas emissions reduction and addressing climate risk. So the vulnerability assessment is meant to identify what are those risks, both to people and to structures within the community. And some of the actions will identify how to address those risks. So an example would be, we have very high heat that could impact systems such as roadways that could melt, or air conditioning systems, which are mechanical systems, which could fail. And even without that, there could be people that are heavily impacted by heat. And so an action can be to set up cooling centers or, provide additional resources for people in that situation. So that's how the risks and climate impacts get translated into actions that we can take in specific situations. So that might be a better answer to what you were talking about. And the city has already been doing those types of things without having, an up-to-date climate action plan. So we had centers when the air quality was really bad. We've had cooling centers when heat was super high, but identifying those things in a more cohesive way will be part of the CAAP process.
Thank you.
Thanks, Leon. Is there? I don't see any other questions, so I think we're gonna move on to our panel discussion. So again, we have, I'd like our panelists, if they would, to all turn on their cameras. That way we can see you all. So we have, and anybody, there we go, Bill Dakin and Lisa Baker and Larry Gunther, who are going to present their kind of focus today. They've been asked to respond to two questions. One is, what are the issues and impacts from your arena, your sector, that you think should be addressed within the city's climate action plan? And then second, what strategies and actions, given what Kerry just shared with us, do you think ought to be evaluated, that it's critical that they be evaluated for mitigation and adaptation actions within the city's plan? Within that, there are those actions and strategies you heard, they're also going to be looked at from their co-benefits and weighted based on the values that the city sets for those actions And so if you have any specific reflections on those two ideas of weighting and weighting the values and the values that the city should be highlighting in the climate action planning process, we'd like to hear about that as well. So we're going to start with Larry Gunther. Larry?
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, thanks to Cool Davis and for everybody who's helping to put this on, and for everybody who showed up. It wouldn't be much, it wouldn't be worthwhile really if people didn't show up. So thanks. Although that can be a little, it can generate a little anxiety when I look at the participant list and see the number of topic experts out there. So I should state that I am here as a representative of Tree Davis and not the Tree Commission. There might be some overlap there, but officially I am here representing Tree Davis. And so the top three issues that we're looking at from kind of the urban forestry standpoint are, a big one is the heat island effect. Trees are absolutely essential for mitigating the heat island impacts. Heat island is basically that paved surfaces and buildings absorb more heat than naturally occurring or even agricultural land. And so they concentrate. Everybody knows this. You drive out through the orchards, right? And you get that nice cool waft of air. And the CDC reports that extreme heat events cause more deaths in the US than all other natural disasters combined. So it's pretty serious. From what we have now, it's going to get worse. And urban spaces in Yolo County can be 10 degrees warmer than the surrounding space during the day. During heat waves, nighttime temperatures can be 22 degrees hotter in town than in outlying areas. So this is it's a big thing. And in fact, there is this connection to transportation that if the city's cooler, it's easier to use public transportation or walking, biking, skateboarding, what have you. So permeable surfaces, urban green spaces are some of the most effective solutions to reducing the heat island effect and reducing air temperatures within the city. Secondly, kind of strategically selecting plant species so that we can reduce the impacts of prolonged summer conditions and more frequent drought. California has become drier. I should also, or maybe I will also state that the National Oceanographic Atmospheric Administration, who collects atmospheric data, you won't be surprised to hear that, but they have, it is now official, the US as a whole is 1 degree Celsius warmer in the last 10 years than it was in previous. So we are warming without any sort of doubt, and the West is part of that. So extreme droughts are likely to become more frequent and intense. Extreme heat combined with extreme drought threaten well-being and our biodiversity. So trees are a big part of trying to reduce the heat island effect, and you can't, dead trees don't help that, basically. So we're looking at trees that are going to thrive and survive in the future when things are hotter and probably drier. So green infrastructure, including landscapes designed with rainwater catchment, and those are extremely important for plant health. Also, not just tree climate ready species, but the understory. Tree Davis has been working on our first go at this was the Lois Walk Grove in the commemorative tree grove over by University Retirement Center. So we used trees that are climate ready, and the understory plants we planted there are also climate ready. So working on that, on those species palettes to make them climate ready is really important. Parks and greenbelts, other spaces are going to be more important, again, for reducing greenhouse, but also for personal well-being, quality of life, making it worth living here. So and other things about green spaces is that they help clean the air. They help increase habitat, wildlife habitat. And as anybody who has walked from an open area to a park knows, they help soothe away stress and they boost our mood. And I don't think those are trivial effects. So significant actions that we should evaluate and include in the final plan. The existing urban tree canopy is one of our best defenses against the other climate impacts. However, up to half of the current tree species commonly planted in Davis are projected to decline in performance under future climate actions. So evaluating the quality or evaluating and quantifying the benefits of our current tree canopy and looking at, again, species that are going to be climate ready, that will actually work in the climate we're advancing toward. So cooling benefits, air quality benefits, stormwater benefits, public health, wellness, economic benefits. Another thing about all these benefits and about the heat island effect is that they are increased in underrepresented neighborhoods because there are fewer trees in poor neighborhoods. And so that's another big part of what Tree Davis has been doing, working on a grant with the city right now, the Community Canopy Grant. So another significant action is strategically selecting tree species that are climate ready. I mentioned that one. So adequately fund and staff the City of Davis Urban Forestry Division. On that last big storm we got, they got 220 service calls that day. And there are, I think there are 3 people in the Urban Forestry Division right now. So adequately funding and staffing the Urban Forestry Division is a very significant action. And prioritizing the spaces in which trees will be planted with climate-ready understory landscapes and green infrastructure installations. And as always, keeping social equity and environmental justice central to this task. And I'll go ahead and end there.
All right. Thank you very much, Larry. So we'll go on now to Lisa Baker.
Hi, everybody. Happy to be here. I'm on the board of Cool Davis. I'm formerly the CEO for Yolo County Housing and currently a public sector consultant to public sector clients on these issues around housing and equity. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about challenges in my area of expertise, which is housing sustainability and equity and inclusion. And so I think that thinking about the questions that were posed, I think one of the things that really strikes me about the city of Davis is that the majority of housing stock in the city was built prior to 1990. That entire housing stock, whether it's single family or multifamily, is extremely maladapted to both current and future climate effects. And specifically, we're talking heat, drought, and high wind volumes. And so what you will be looking at in terms of more catastrophic weather, which you've already seen a taste of in the last couple of years, is, and as I think Larry also alluded, more damage to buildings. But this will also mean higher insurance costs because insurance pools are getting increasingly hit, and that's going to result in a bigger hit to either multifamily or single family owners in terms of their insurance. It will be health impacts to residents. I think if you follow the news over the last decade, you can already see in Europe what maladapted properties impacts had, for example, in Paris during high heat events when many people literally died in their homes due to the effects of heat. And then you're going to get unbearable outdoor working conditions, whether it's high heat or poor air quality due to pollution or particulate matter from wildfires. So this impacts the ability to get out there and actually make improvements to properties on a timely basis when they need to be made. And as Kerry talked about in her presentation, shorter equipment life. So that doesn't just mean city things or stores. That means your own home AC or multifamily infrastructure. All of that equipment is subject in stressful heat and weather conditions to a much shorter equipment life, which also translates into higher costs. So I see that as being one of the big issues in terms of just the infrastructure in which we all live for the city. And the second issue.
Lisa, I'm sorry, can I interrupt you? Is there a way to increase your volume a little bit? It's a little difficult to hear you.
I heard that before. And
that's better, that's great. So maybe just a little closer to the microphone. Thank you so much.
Better? Better? Yes? Okay. All right. So I think, so that's it. Maladapted properties, 67%, I think, of the city's housing stock was built prior to 1990. So that's a big number. The second piece is that there's a continued lack of adequate housing types and price points to accommodate the city's population. This is leading to reduced equity, but also increased resident vulnerability and also impacts on social service functions and policing functions and on the community infrastructure. So one of the things I think that's really hard to escape from when you're talking about climate action or you're talking about equity inclusion is that housing, multimodal transit options, food, and access to employment and ways out of poverty are all very deeply intertwined and really have to be thought of as linked systems. And so that has an entire range of challenges for the community with regard to its CAAP. So in thinking about those issues and thinking about solutions, a few things that come to mind would be the need to promote compact and connected communities throughout the city, not just in its central core. I think if you go to Davis, you can really see the marked contrast between newer subdivisions and developments versus the city central core and its access to close walking, shopping, park and green infrastructure. And being able to build in that type of connected community throughout the city is important over time. Finding ways that are innovative to reduce heat island effects, not just through the kinds of things that Larry had talked about, which are all important, but also through blocking and shading so that your city streets in those core areas are shaded during particular times of the day to reduce your heat island effect. And then I think right now the city's also going through its housing element process, which talks about its regional housing needs assessment numbers and its affordability levels and needs. And embedded within that are programs to improve type and availability of housing. And so making sure that the CAAP and the housing element are actually, since they're being built in parallel, that they're actually also sort of co-reinforcing each other, and you're being able to embed programs in both of those will be very important. And part of that programming can be that you are building in that equity and affordability, but also addressing the maladapted property issues through rehabilitation of existing multifamily and single family homes to adapt them to current conditions. And I've been asked by Chris just to talk a little bit about some of the things we had done in the multifamily sector while I was at Yolo Housing. And we had been working for about a decade, realizing that climate change was coming and trying to adapt properties built between the 50s and the 80s primarily to be prepared for where we find ourselves today. And so some of the things that we did over that time was window replacement for ultra high efficiency window panes. We converted all of the interior lighting for our properties to LED to reduce interior heat loads from light bulbs. We changed out all our parking lot lights to current generation LED lights in order to reduce sort of energy consumption load. We switched to a cool roof standard to reduce heat load in the attic spaces, thereby also reducing interior heat, and work to sort of harden our systems and create multiple redundancy, including working with Valley Clean Energy and installing solar farms. And we also worked with the Yolo Solano AQMD to actually start doing air quality monitoring out in some of our properties. So if you were in the, during the big wildfire event and you were turning on purple air, then some of the time you were looking at air monitoring stations that were set on Yolo County housing properties. And that was a great way to introduce equity into that space for our residents, and also to make sure that our workers were also safe when they were out in the field. Finally, I think if you're talking about programs for rehabilitation on the single family side or for new development, I think you're looking for ways to do aquifer recharge, as Larry talked about, permeable surfaces, but also climate adapted landscaping, rain gardens, reducing overall consumption. When I was at Yolo Housing, we worked with Tree Woodland and Tree Davis on a, and Larry might remember, on a new tree replacement program for our properties. And we were looking at climate adapted, pollution resistant and drought tolerant tree alternatives, which we adopted as our replacement standard as we lost trees that were maladapted for the current climate conditions. And that was super helpful to maintain that tree canopy. Finally, there's a lot of things you need to do in order to increase the autonomy and resilience of the individual home or multifamily building, so that you're not relying on energy systems to achieve all of your climate get, because the power goes out, you still need to be cool or be able to do things. And so you can be looking at using paint colors, cool roof systems, rethinking about how you look at ventilation systems, and really looking at some of those passive systems, again, as a way to achieve a much better autonomy for that unit. And diversity in housing type and affordability, so that we can accommodate our community need. And then I would just suggest also that housing is intertwined with transportation. I'm also the chair of the Citizens Advisory Committee for Yolo Transit. And so really starting to look at multimodal and first and last mile connection, so that we can start to get at those VMT. And that's it for me, thanks.
Thank you. That was very complete response. And from the housing perspective, all the things that touch our lives, where we live. Thank you so much. So I'd like to go on to Bill Dakin, and Bill's going to cover a little more on building energy.
Yeah, hi everyone. Bill Dakin here. What I'm talking about, focusing on is kind of the built environment, but it touches so much on what Larry and Lisa talked about, because with the built environment, what you have is your tree canopy can have a big impact on the comfort and energy use of homes, and equity is kind of always needs to be addressed when we're talking about the built environment. So the top three kind of issues that I want to cover are, the first being electrification of existing buildings, kind of shifting away from our natural gas end uses and shifting those over to electricity, using highly efficient heat pump technology where applicable when it comes to space and water heating, and increasingly more maybe available coming soon with clothes drying. Heat pump technology can deliver heating, cooling for space heating as well as water heating, and can do clothes drying much more efficiently than natural gas or electric resistance. For cooking, it's induction cooking is a very efficient and effective technology to replace gas cooking, in addition to the benefits for carbon reduction, there's what I consider the biggest benefit is to indoor air quality and the health of people living in those homes. There's been lots of studies. Lawrence Berkeley Lab has done lots of studies that show that gas cooking results in much higher NOx emissions and pollution. Indoor is the biggest cause of indoor air pollution in the home. And so it's really important to consider that. Pairing electrification with additional PV, I think, is also maybe a good strategy when we're talking about electrification, because potentially switching from natural gas appliance to an electric appliance can lead to potentially higher bills, which we need to be really concerned about when it comes to especially multifamily rental communities and equity issues. And by providing additional PV to offset those additional electricity uses can then both reduce energy costs to the renters and ratepayers, and it improves the cost effectiveness. The next, I think, important strategy, which kind of ties into what was mentioned earlier, is improving our existing building efficiencies within the existing building stock. So current new construction code is fairly, is pretty far advanced. In fact, for the city of Davis, there's a electric preferred. It really encourages all electric new development in Davis, and coming in a couple of years, the next code cycle, new construction will even be more statewide, will encourage electrification with buildings. But with existing buildings, it's really important to not only look at electrification, but also opportunities to improve the comfort of the home. And this is necessary to improve the resiliency of our built environment. And in addition to like improving windows or insulation, I mean, things like tree canopy have a huge impact on comfort of a home. If you do lose power, if you have a tree canopy around the building, your building and the building is well insulated, it's going to do much better during power outages. So that's always really important to consider. Lastly, the last topic is to allow and encourage grid integration. As we go to more electrification, there's going to be more of a shift, and there's a lot of activity going towards this, using battery storage, but also using water heating for load shifting, pre-cooling strategies. Cool Davis has a great video on how to do pre-cooling, which I watched and actually used last summer. And being that we were working from home, it was very useful. So I encourage everyone to look at that. Also, bi-directional EV charging, it's not quite there yet, but I think it might be happening soon. And the ability to maybe use our electric vehicles to provide some resiliency within our buildings. As far as the actions that that the climate action plan should look towards are, what are the impacts of electrification on the local and regional grid? Investigate community microgrid and integrated storage as a means to address both climate change and resiliency, and allow us to increase that demand for electricity, reduce the need for that demand for electricity at certain times of year. Another thing is how do we address existing housing when it comes to our rental and retail market, where we have a lot of rental housing in Davis, and how are we going to get there? We can't get there with early adopters and new construction alone. We have to look at, are there financing opportunities or carrots that we can provide to encourage building owners to make these improvements to their buildings so that they can reap the benefits, and then also the tenants can also reap those benefits and provide a win-win. Lastly, the thing I'd like to just bring up, which is something maybe a little more nascent, but everybody's talking about, you know, decarbonization of the grid and decarbonization of buildings, but we need to start looking and thinking about decarbonization of the embodied carbon of how we build our buildings. And I'd like to see some investigation on how we can look at that as far as what kind of building materials or strategies can be done to reduce the amount of embodied carbon that's in our buildings, concrete being a big contributor to that. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bill. So last we have Jim Kramer, who's going to take a couple minutes here and kind of wrap us up.
Thank you, Chris, and thanks for everybody for attending here. So Chris asked me to talk about certain local organizations and so on, and one was faith community. To a considerable extent, Lynn Nittler has already talked about that in terms of the Yolo Interfaith Alliance for Climate Justice. I'll just mention that most faith communities have strong sort of theological support for the notion of caring for God's creation. And many of the faith communities take positions actively to promote that. In Davis, a number of churches and faith communities have installed solar panels on their roofs and are encouraging the membership to install solar at home. Several of the faith communities have engaged in efforts at promoting local food production, local food consumption, emphasizing vegetarian, reducing the use of meat and so on. So, and then a number of the faith communities have also promoted conservation. You know, they've been, you know, the churches have been putting in LED lights and double pane windows and so on and so forth. So there's a number of efforts among the faith communities. The other organization that I represent is Sierra Club. And in general, Sierra Club endorses the same kinds of goals as the City of Davis, carbon neutrality by 2040, if not sooner, and so on. Let me mention some of the specific actions, well, general actions that Sierra Club is advocating and comment on how those are pertinent to Davis. In the area of energy, certainly the Sierra Club promotes renewable energy and specifically solar and distributed energy systems. And distributed energy systems implies heavy reliance on solar rooftop. And in that connection, we need to note that PG&E and the other two private utility companies are actively pushing hard to install obstacles to try and discourage rooftop solar. The Sierra Club is advocating strongly at the Public Utilities Commission against this. At the legislature, AB 1139 by Gonzalez is price changes which would practically eliminate rooftop solar. And so we need to contact Aguilar Curry and Senator Dodd to encourage them to vote against AB 1139. In the area of transportation, certainly for all motor vehicles, the Sierra Club is pushing for electrification. For private automobiles, you know, light duty vehicles, that means moving entirely towards EV cars, electric cars. It also means reducing vehicle miles traveled. And one of the implications of this is for EVs, there has to be much more construction of charging stations. And in terms of reducing vehicle miles traveled, one of the strategies is to try and reduce commuting and sprawl, and that means increasing the urban density. For heavy-duty vehicles, a lot of the emphasis on electrification has to do with hydrogen fuel cells, and Sierra Club is pushing for all buses and heavy-duty vehicles to be electric. And Davis might need to consider charging stations for hydrogen fuel cells if we're going to electrify our buses and heavy-duty vehicles. The Sierra Club in the area of buildings is pushing very hard for all electric buildings, and I needn't say much more. Lisa and Bill have talked extensively about what needs to be done in the area of buildings. Finally, the Sierra Club is emphasizing very strongly the issue of equity and inclusion. And so for every single one of these policies, efforts have to be directed specifically at low income and underrepresented minorities to try and allow them to have solar cars, EV cars, to have better transportation, better buildings, and so on. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Jim. That was a great and very quick summary. So it leaves us a little bit of time to answer some questions. I can see lots of comments in the chat, but I'm hoping that I'll have, yes, I see Richard Bode has raised his hand. So I'll acknowledge you and then you can unmute. Go ahead, Richard.
Right. One thing I'd like to ask of Kerry is I'd love to see how they're going to put the greenhouse gas inventory together. Because kind of a local regional inventory is a lot different than what you'd expect on a statewide level. In other words, the state looks at transportation sources. It means all the gasoline sold inside the state. But of course, Davis does a lot of commuting. People commute out of the city or they commute into the city. So anyway, the basis of that would be pretty helpful in saying what kind of targets we have. And then I think this is something that Bill brought up too, is the charging infrastructure. Actually, it was also what Lisa triggered in my mind is how old the buildings are in Davis, even the residential buildings. And since we are kind of a slow growth city, even homes, trying to update them so they can have charging stations in the garage actually gets a little expensive. You usually have to put in some new panels and things. So it might be nice to have a little, as part of your work you do, how intensive that would be. I'll have to tell you, my house was built in 1999, and for me, it was a breeze putting in an EV charger. But quite a few people I've talked to had older homes, and it cost them a little bit to upgrade their panels and stuff. And then the whole apartment scene is a real important thing to start working on immediately, because they're also the people that might be the ones that inherit or want to buy the new used EVs that are going to hit the market. There's a lot of people have owned in the early adopters of EVs. As the new models come out, they'll be getting rid of those guys and putting in used cars on the market and buying new ones. So, but being able for some people who live in apartments, even students, it's really important to get that infrastructure up. So that's all.
Well, great. I don't know, Chris, if you have time for me to make a couple responses here. I know we're getting to the end of the time and there's a lot of questions, but you're on mute, Chris.
What I'm going to do is ask everybody to voice their questions. Please make it a question, not just a comment. If you do have specific things you want to have the city include in the CAAP, just put it in the chat. But these are questions that you would like to have any of our panelists answer or Kerry. So I'm going to go through and have everybody ask their question, and then Kerry, that'll give you a chance to do responses as well as our other panelists. So Steve.
Okay, thanks for being here, Kerry. The number one source of emissions is cars, and I really don't think the city can do a lot about cars. I think the state's got to step up on that one. But the city does have a lot of control over buildings. What's it going to take to get the city to do more? why don't we outlaw gas? Why don't we require, conversion at time that HVAC systems are replaced? Why don't we require any new construction? What's stopping us?
Thanks, Stephen. Johnston?
I took my question down.
Okay. And Alan Hirsch.
Thank you. My question is, in terms of housing and building, is the biggest impact is transportation. Putting our dense housing near transit corridors where people have alternatives are important, and that's one thing that I'm through with Steve, that basically that's something the city can do in the housing plan. I'm just worrying whether that's on people's radar in terms of where the housing is, not just that they're all Title 24. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. Kerry?
Well, thank you. And I just want to comment that these suggestions are all so important. And as I mentioned earlier, we are getting to these actions, but we haven't necessarily identified them all or prioritized them all yet. And so the panel discussion, the input from the others is all so important. And I've been, a lot of this is familiar. A lot of this is planned to be incorporated into the CAAP. We've spoken with Tree Davis about climate resilient landscapes. We've spoken about transportation. We have a consultant specifically addressing some of our transportation issues. And we know that a lot of this is the combination of good actions and what is related to behavior, because some things the city has control of and other things it's really community members that have control of that. So it's a complicated issue. We're going to try to wrap all this together, and it will be in June and maybe late June and July that we'll be starting to have some of these community workshops that will address many of these potential solutions that we will be incorporating into the CAAP. So I really appreciate all of that input. One thing that I wanted to say is that some of this needs to be incorporated into either resources or funding or incentives or some other way to get people to want to do some of these changes, because we cannot direct people to spend more money on implementation of certain things like building energy and all. And one of the things that we are hoping to do that is not currently part of our contract, which is a direct result of this contract coming together right at the time of the beginning of COVID, and we had some uncertainties about available funding. So certain elements that were going to be incorporated into the contract needed to be removed and will be added. So we're trying to make sure that in the next budget cycle, we have some money to identify funding alternatives, grant opportunities, and possibly a GHG offset program that would be a local program to provide some funding for incentivizing some of these programs. So as I say, it's not part of the project right now, but it will be part of the project. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of community discussion about that. A couple quick things. We are addressing leaf blowers in a process separate from the CAAP process that is ongoing. The NRC is taking a look at that, and either already or very shortly, we have some surveys online to get some community input in 3 areas. One is community members that have thoughts about leaf blowers, people that work in the landscape industry that have thoughts about whether or not we should have leaf blowers, as well as other communities that have either implemented reductions or bans or are considering it or have limited that. Somebody asked about cool pavements. Absolutely, there are cool pavement options as well as cool roof options. Or I guess actually you asked about cool roofs. Both are things that the city is already taking a look at. And I would like to say that we are somewhat at the forefront with our energy reach codes in the state. So, and I know that Bill and others could address this in more detail, but I participated in writing the reach code. We do have to meet cost effectiveness standards for energy codes. And reach codes do address only new construction, and we also need to address our existing built environment. So as Bill mentioned, our current reach code incentivizes all electric new development by using the cost effectiveness study to increase requirements for mixed fuel developments. That would be gas plus electric, and keeping at the basic energy code requirements any project that is all electric, which saves developers a significant amount of money. And we've had some success with those projects being developed without even installing natural gas lines. Dealing with the existing built environment takes another set of priorities, ordinances, standards, and we are working toward that. But you know, it's something that's on our radar. We do have a number of things that Davis has already done. We have a solar ordinance. We have a very high solar adoption compared to most cities in California and across the nation. Some of that information is linked on the Cool Davis website. We've switched all of our public light fixtures to LED fixtures from whatever they were before. And so that has saved a significant amount of money and energy. We do have a cool roof ordinance, so all roof replacements need to use cool roof materials. Of course, as you all know, we have Valley Clean Energy that is doing a lot of work in energy in our community. And we've done a lot of actions on things like trees and updating the ordinance, which is in progress. And soon we will have, as many of you know, an RFP has been released to update our urban forestry master plan, or whatever it's called. I know, Ellen, you've said that there are some different names for it, but there's also some components that we've done, like our walkability and bikeability in our community, that really encourages people to do a lot of that. And finally, we have funding for installation of electric vehicle charging infrastructure. So, you know, there is still so much to do, and we have not done everything to date that we could, but we're heading in that direction. And so I'd like to both challenge us to do more and recognize what we are doing. So those were just a few comments that I had, skimming over the surface of some of what's the great suggestions that have been made.
Thanks, Kerry. I think we have a few more questions. There's a few people with their hands in the air. I see Larry. Richard, I'm not sure if you still have a question, and Leilani. And then I think John Johnston put a question in the chat about who is the city in the city's climate action plan. Is it just the municipality, or is it all of us? And what does that, you know, mean in terms of the plan itself?
Well, if you're talking about the carbon reduction goals, the community carbon neutrality is everything. It's all of our community, not just municipal. I think we could do a better job with our municipal actions to be a good role model, and that might be an outcome from the climate action and adaptation plan. I mean, why should we ask landlords and developers to do things if the city is not also doing those things? So we need to recognize where we've fallen short in some areas and address those needs. But we are talking about community carbon neutrality. So if that's your question, that's what we're addressing. And it's a heavy lift, especially trying to get this done before the state targets. Because the state will be helping with many of these goals, but we, the project management team, don't want this to just be a climate action and adaptation plan in words and not action. We want this to actually take us on a roadmap toward carbon neutrality by our target date that is a real target date.
So Larry.
Yeah, not a question, but actually as a panelist, I wanted to address one of the questions. So Steve Wheeler, I think, mentioned the city doesn't have a lot of impact on transportation. I would really disagree with that. The way we zone, the way we build has huge impacts on the kind of transportation that's required. So in Old East Davis, we are a residential community, but we have stores, churches, services, shops. And I know at least a half a dozen people who walk or bike to work within the neighborhood or downtown or at the university. Another way to really reduce the need for transportation is to build along existing transit corridors at places that have hubs, shopping malls, putting residential there, and along our major transportation corridors where we already have public transportation service. So I actually think there's a lot the city can do. And I think they can actually do more than the state on that one.
Thanks, Larry. Leilani.
Hi, Bill mentioned this, I
Bill
think.
Dakin, yes.
Bill Dakin, you mentioned this really briefly, but I wonder if you or other area experts could speak to the paradox that I've been noticing in electrifying residences and buildings at a time when the grid has so many vulnerabilities and increased vulnerabilities with climate crisis.
Great question, Leilani.
Well, yeah, that is a good question. The grid needs, as the grid needs to, and I'm not a grid expert. There is somebody who I'm on who's actually at a conflicting meeting who could speak to this much better, Lorenzo Christoph, who used to work for CalISO. But I think as a region, we need to look at resiliency of our grid and looking at things like microgrids within the community with renewables and storage that can not only provide, allow for flexibility on demands and amount of renewable resources, but also be able to handle those critical resources. And resiliency within our buildings is also really important. And that's what I was talking about with, making sure our buildings are comfortable during these times. Natural gas doesn't provide more reliability. Yes, it does. It can provide some cooking, but all of our gas appliances now require electricity. All the new water heaters and all furnaces still require electricity. So in a lot of cases, those gas appliances are just as vulnerable to these power outages as well. But you can look at it as an individual, looking at maybe getting some storage, but I think as the community, I think we need to look at providing more resiliency within our grid. But that's not my expertise.
Thank you.
So I can't speak to what the solutions are. I know they're out there and people are talking about it.
Thanks, Bill. So, Lisa.
Kind of speak in amplification, I think, of some of these issues. So some folks have talked about zoning and siting being critical. And I just really want to emphasize that the housing element takes up those issues. The housing element is a required element of the city's general plan and is it is one of the only elements that has to be updated on a regular cycle. That cycle is taking place right now. So if you're interested in how climate impacts housing, affordability, diversity, then that and how it rolls over into the zoning is what will get taken up in the housing element. And so it's really important that folks that are interested in climate are also paying attention to the housing element so that you can be sure that those changes actually get codified where they need to be. So I really want to emphasize that. Secondly, on the energy component, I want to go back to what Larry talked about and Leilani and Bill Dakin, which is that notion in my comments about autonomy in order to have resilience. So you need more autonomy within the building that you live in yourself, your unit or your home, but also regional. And so while I was at Yolo Housing, we were actually in discussions with providers on starting to look at microgrid development so that you have a way to really be in one integrated grid when it was, when you could, because you get the value of and synergy of the large system, but be able to like close down to sort of closed cell systems in cases of wildfire and other things, so that when portions of the grid are down, whole communities don't go down as well. So it's not a question of either or to a very large extent, it's a question of and a lot of those ands hinge on the ability to get to good storage systems. We're not quite there yet, although it looks like we're getting much closer. So that's just my 2 cents. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Lisa. So I'm going to take, I think we have one more question. We're a little over time, and I'm so glad that everybody has been able to stick with us, or a number of you have. So Alan. Alan,
sorry, I didn't take my hand down.
Oh, okay. So we are done. Well, I want to thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today, for the great questions that we had, and our panelist and our speaker, Kerry, for taking time. I know this has been a crazy busy time for you in getting the CAAP off the ground. I want to encourage everybody to go to the city's website and dig in on the documents and things that are there. Make sure you share the survey with as many people as you can, so that the city gets a broad strokes from our community of different input from different neighborhoods. Share it with your neighborhood lists. Also, like Lisa said, there's a lot of other planning things going on right now. The housing element, the downtown plan as well are also going through a process. And it's important to make sure that things are consistent across those plans. So we hope that you will continue to participate, and Cool Davis is committed to keeping everybody informed about next steps and the continuing process as the city moves through this process for the climate action plan. So so glad you could join us, and we look forward to seeing you at another Cool Davis event or meeting in the future.
And come to the workshop next week. I will send information to Cool Davis, and hopefully they will send it out to all of you and post it on the website. One last thing, we are also at the city implementing SB 1383, which has to do with waste reduction, which is another major effort that is engaging all of the city staff. So there is a lot going on at this moment. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks for showing up, everyone. Good to see everyone.